we're going to start with a few prepared questions for the panel, and then we will open it up to those of you in attendance, both here in person and online, for additional questions. We're back by popular demand. We did a ADU roundtable discussion back in February 2020, and again, it was asked of us to do it again, and so we have our panel that was gracious enough to be in attendance. And just a quick introduction: they're very modest panel, so they didn't submit very large bios. So we have R.S. Arxian, building official from Santa Monica. We have Estene Melian, city planning chief administrating.
Chief zoning administrator.
Chief zoning administrator. Sorry about that. I should know that. I would Estene a lot. We have Minye Pak. She's with LA City Department of Building and Safety. She works closely with Estene as far as policy and enforcement of our zoning ordinance. We do have our residential inspector. He ran some traffic. He'll be here a little later, but we can go ahead and get started without him. So I will go ahead and ask a few questions again, and the panel will respond in turn before turning it over to the audience. And I want to remind the audience, when you do speak, especially for those in person, I was told that myself, the OWL technology that we're using is very sensitive. So if you do have a question in person, please speak clearly and face the OWL here in the center room so that they can pick you up. All right, without further ado, I know our panel is a little LA City heavy, but that's for a reason. LA City was one of the first ones to establish an ADU ordinance locally. They work closely with the state and establish ordinance. And as far as the ADU memos that we have, information we have available, both on the city planning and building and safety websites for Los Angeles City. So the first question pertains to that. And Aura can speak on this as well as a ex-LA City official here. So I'm sure he has no reservations about chiming in. First question. Can you please provide some background on the implementation of the city's ADU ordinance and some of the key policy discussions since you visited us last time in February 2020?
Sure. Can everyone hear me okay? Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be back. I think it was right before COVID when we had the last panel discussion, and we were just embarking on kind of implementing our ordinance, coming up with the ADU memo, which some of you may be familiar with. It was released in February of 2020, and that was a joint memo, and we did that deliberately with the Department of Building and Safety. Chad Doy at the time, who was also on the panel with me, signed it, and our effort was to really help implement the memo. And since then, we've had a lot of changes that have made us kind of now embark on the 2.0 version, which hopefully will be out shortly. We're hoping, so we keep working on it, and more changes come on board, and we want to incorporate more. So there's also the state handbook, the ADU handbook, which was released in July 2022, which is the most recent version of it. That again, that goes to all jurisdictions. More recently, again, the state bills, AB 2221 and SB 897, made us kind of revisit our ordinance again and come up with the ZA Memo 142, which was released December 29. Based on the more recent state changes, if we didn't kind of update our ordinance, it would be kind of considered null and void. So we had to incorporate all the state changes and kind of make sure our local ordinance was complementary and consistent with the state provisions as well. So right now, going in, a third year into it, we're looking at how a revised memo between the two departments can help answer all the more intricate questions we've seen, all the little bit gray areas of how we're still complying with state law, and also as we've seen issues come up, working with building and safety, we're trying to clarify those and implement our ordinance consistent with the state and with the additional kind of questions that have been coming up, especially with phasing. I'll stop there, and I don't know if you have anything more to add to that from building and safety's perspective on implementing it.
Right, so from building and safety perspective, we do encounter a lot of common issues that arise as we implement and review a lot of these ADs that come in. And so we try to, as we work through and interpret and apply to all of these different existing and unique situations, to try to come up with some consistency in applying them throughout the city. And so those are the kind of things that we're trying to incorporate into this updated memo so that it's a little bit easier to navigate for everybody.
With City of Santa Monica, as many other small jurisdictions, there was no set of ordinances to put one after other, whether state assembly, state Senate bills and assembly bills. However, we have about 60 pages long ADU handbook that was prepared for our customers, and it's online, and customers can use that. And all the guidelines and compliance with both local zoning ordinance and the state laws are covered there.
Perfect, thank you. Can everyone hear okay? We're getting feedback from, I know there was some concerns earlier about the volume. Are we all good? No? Okay, before we move on to the next question, I do want to introduce our last member of the panel, Devin Myrick. He's our Chief Inspector in charge of residential construction here in LA City. He oversees all single family duplexes, including ADUs. So some of those questions later on will address inspection, but I'm sure we'll hear from him at that time. Next question. What has been the overall impact of the state ADU laws and or the local ordinances in facilitating ADU development?
I'm happy to get started on that. Overall impact, obviously, we've seen a lot of ADU permits coming through. There's been a lot of inquiries, there's been a lot of interest. It's been a little bit more interesting with SB9 also kind of coming on board more recently, kind of how that interface with the ADU ordinance. But in general, the numbers have really skyrocketed on development of additional housing. Matt Leslie, my counterpart, who's more on the policy side, couldn't be here today, but he did have some really good updates on the numbers and the trends we've seen. And that may be, I know in our newsletters and other kind of publications, we keep track of all the increases in the production of housing. And I know Minye has some interesting facts also from the permitting side as well to share.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't have the exact numbers of ADU permits that were issued. However, last year, we had over 60% of our permits for single family and duplex type of projects. A good portion of which were ADUs and SB9. So they are steadily still coming in.
All right. Next question. We know it can be challenging to have regulations in state law, local ordinances, and the building code. Can you share some of your experience in navigating through all of these and how they intersect?
Okay, I guess we'll kind of pass this round from, I think get started on that one. It's definitely been challenging as we have an ordinance that there's a process to update it and pass it through again. And so when the state laws come on board, we really have to go back and read our ordinance and make sure that it's consistent. Some of the things more recently, we had to do what's called a zoning administrator's memo, ZA memo. And that's kind of like a Band-Aid where we say, okay, this is gonna be our practice until we go back and update the code or update the ordinance to reflect the more permanent changes. So we've been using that tool. There's two tools we kind of have in the Office of Building Administration. One is called the Zoning Administrator's Interpretation, and the other one is called the Zoning Administrator's Memorandum. And actually, our ordinance baked those in the ordinance of the ADU, saying that we will allow the zoning administrator to have the ability to make updates or interpretations to make sure that our ordinance is consistent with state. So I think that really helped us be able to keep up with some of the regulations as they're being updated and for us to keep up with it and be consistent with it. Obviously, the memo has been a really great tool between the two departments to help with the implementation of that. And there are a lot of different options for the developers or the designers. So having the memo outline what rules apply if you're doing an ADU per state exemption versus if you're doing an ADU per the local ordinance, kind of we have a table and we're gonna hopefully update and make that even more user-friendly next version. That has been our resource and kind of what we hope the developers, designers, general public, other departments, even our staff can use to help kind of keep up with all the various regulations.
Yeah, I think it's also important to note that, if, for these ADU options, it's important to choose which version you're going with, whether it's the state or ordinance, and then to kind of stick with that regulation. It's kind of challenging when we try to mix and match those regulations, so we've tried to make it clear in our memo to separate how each of those ADU options would work. In terms of building code, in general, all of the building code regulations must be complied with, except for as explicitly stated in the state code, such as, fire sprinkler waivers and residential uses not being changed due to the addition of an ADU. In addition, LA City has an information bulletin specifically for ADU conversions of existing structures. And so that was created to provide a guide for building code requirements, recognizing that there are a lot of existing conditions that it would be a hardship to comply with current code requirements, but would still be sufficient for life and safety. And so that is a resource that can be found on our website to implement and try to find some relief in converting these existing structures.
And I would like to add Media's point that state law is, of course, encouraging housing, but it doesn't mean that any law or any politician will encourage substandard housing. So the buildings need to comply with the state building code. So if in any case for local jurisdiction, for local zoning ordinances, there will be a little bit more relaxed applications. For state law, the buildings need to comply with fire and safety provisions of state law. And of course, we are having cases when existing structure is not in compliance, any hardship there to bring to compliance. But I would like to mention about a couple of organizational efforts here done through this ICC, LA Basin chapter. We have administrative committee and we have inspection committee, fire life safety committee. They are very involved and they are bringing their experiences and they are sharing their experiences and sharing my best practices, coming up with policies, which type of application should be approved, or coming up with on common ground to see which applications will be okay to approve. That will be a regional agreement between the building officials, so we are consistent and customers are not confused. Like one jurisdiction is approving reduced foundation depth, the other is very strict on that. One jurisdiction is asking for new address, the other jurisdiction doesn't allow new address to be applied to ADU. So these committees, inspection committee and fire life safety committee and admin committee, they do great work, and I would suggest to join these committees and bring your questions there and get lots of answers to that committee. Thank you.
Great final point, or yes, one of the underlying factors for these types of discussions, especially ADUs, we heard the numbers, how many permits are issued just for accessory dwelling units because of the housing need. It's important for us to be locally, to be consistent, not only with the state, but with each other, so that when you do have applicants in various jurisdictions, they're met with the same criteria across the board. So we can move on from here, and this is a question for all members of the panel here. What are some of the challenges you encounter when it comes to ADUs in regards to processing, permitting, and inspections? So the challenges you encounter when it comes to ADUs.
I can softly get started, but I know there's a lot more we can get into permitting and also inspection. One of the challenges with the ordinance, I think, from a zoning perspective, was a lot of the phasing and the sequencing. And I can give a couple of examples of that. The local ordinance relied on the state for the multifamily, and it said it has to be an existing multifamily. So naturally, if a project was coming in proposing a new multifamily, it was kind of difficult for them to do the ADUs within that. Also with parking, when you have to have an existing, the minute you we had a lot of projects that wanted to have an existing duplex, tear it down or bring modular and put it in the back, but they wanted to demolish the duplex in the front, build the ADUs, and then build a new duplex in the front. But once you got rid of the duplex, then you no longer have an existing multifamily. So that was a huge challenge from a zoning or sequencing perspective. So we were constantly thinking of what's the overall goal. At the end, you're going to end up with the same project. You can get it upgraded, it will be a better project, but how do we overcome the challenge of the exact wording? Luckily, I think with the most recent bills that got passed, it helped us with the sequencing because they included existing multifamily. And also with some of the parking with the AB 2097 or even SB 9, it kind of helped us with giving different options for that too. So I'll stop with kind of more of the zoning interpretation or us trying to align with state and allow flexibility, but be consistent to not do overreach from zoning perspective. And I know Minier gets most of the challenges from the permitting perspective, definitely.
Sure. So during plan check review and permitting, I think that it's, for the most part, we've seen ADU projects being pretty straightforward. So a lot of ADUs have been permitted successfully. The common issues arise when you have existing structures with certain specific conditions, and we have to work around those conditions. So those are the challenging, kind of case by case projects that we have to work through. But for the most part, what we've seen is that they are pretty straightforward. The state laws allow for such, assistance in zoning reductions and applications. And so that's what we've seen so far. I think another challenge that we encountered during the plan check is when the project site is located in a very specific area, such as maybe coastal zone or a flood zone or any of the specific plans through the planning department. So when those kind of projects come in, they sometimes don't realize that they are subject to these very specific geographical kind of considerations that are not addressed and not waived by the ADU state laws or ordinance. And so just trying to keep in mind that when proposing these ADUs for sites to do like some thorough research on the site and what really needs to be complied with.
I mean, yeah, what I'd love to add is one of the most successful things I think we've been able to do is really collaborate between the two departments to make sure that though we want to be creative, we want to allow from zoning flexibility, doesn't get into what Ara just mentioned about the fire life safety issues, because those could be a reason to kind of say, okay, we've been flexible, but we don't want an unsafe or have a situation where it may not be a great place for someone to live. One example is kind of the minute they want to put an ADU on top of a garage, the accessory building may kick into different setbacks, and is that now creating nonconformity? And we've kind of gone back and forth. We look at these, is it purely zoning? Is it otherwise complying with all the ADU provisions? Or is there another bigger issue we should consider from access, safety, or other things? So it's been really great to work with the departments together, and if we need to, we pull in other departments to get their feedback on it and kind of resolve the issue if one project has that unique situation and kind of find a best solution for it. I think that has been, we meet very regularly, and there's always something you haven't thought about that comes up.
Yeah, so we're trying to be really consistent here and making sure that both departments are on the same page. Another thing I wanted to add was A lot of the challenges that we've been facing have been addressed recently through the January 1st effective dates for SB 92 unit developments. Also AB 297, where we're not allowed to impose required parking for certain sites if it meets our eligibility criteria. And so we find that more and more as time goes on, the state does address some of the common issues that have come up and really implemented into state law.
Other primary inspection issues are related to existing structures. Oftentimes the existing construction, whether it's the framing, the foundation, footing, slab, it's dilapidated and not able to accommodate an addition or even the alteration to make it an ADU. That often results in the building being demolished or far more being removed than what was originally planned, which now can kick in other planning or plan check requirements. That frequently causes problems for people. Many other issues, but those would be the primary issues we face with ADUs in terms of inspection.
To add to that, I would suggest all the design professionals working in any jurisdiction first do their study. Even though the state law is kind of similar for all the jurisdictions, each jurisdiction they have their specific climatic, geographical conditions that they have specific requirements. In some cases, you will see that the street not having a true access, let's say cul-de-sacs, do not allow to have ADUs. Very high fire hazard severity zone, they do not allow ADUs, and so on and so on. With the conversion of existing structures, the challenge is coming in addition to foundation and the framing. Also is, yes, it is a legal structure, accessory structure. Is it intended for human occupancy? Not necessarily. If the, for example, if the public utility allowed to have that structure within their easement, taking into consideration that it's going to be garage or just a storage shed, now converting to house, should we talk to utility to see if they are okay to have that habitable space underneath of their power lines? So these are the things that should be taken into consideration and check with the building department and other departments that are involved in the permitting process to make sure that the ADU is possible to have that conversion.
Absolutely, and I want to underline what Devin said about the existing structure. You also have to consider the items that are not shown on the plans when permitted. You have all your NEP, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, right? I'm sure inspectors have heartburn when you're trying to place, the design contractors try to place a clean out or a sewer or something to that effect that doesn't show up on the plans, but inspectors have to deal with on site. So I'm sure that'll come up in a few other questions later on. All great insight. Thank you very much for that. Continuing on, we're going to move into recommendations. Do you have any recommendations on how to make the ADU permitting process run more smoothly?
That's a tough question, but I guess there's two ways we can approach it. One is from a designer or a homeowner or someone wanting to do an ADU. I think in general, there's a lot of buzz around ADUs. Everyone knows kind of what it is, but what is very different is there's state provisions, and then each local jurisdiction can have their own zoning standards on top of that. So I think first, kind of knowing the distinction between what are the state regulations and is there a local provision as well, that would be great kind of to be able to design per the standards of that city or regulation that you're trying to design for. There's a lot of resources out there, and maybe Minya can get a little bit more into that on kind of what the city of LA has. But and then I would kind of flip that to our obligation, kind of from the city has been, we also need to talk to each other, be solution oriented, and kind of work with the applicant, because a lot of the times the homeowners that they come to us, they may not know everything, and how can we kind of bring them up to speed, give them the resources, give them the tools, and if there is something that is that 5% or 1% that might come up, how do we kind of give them an answer so they can either go redesign or no, there's other options. Most of the time, there's different options they can pick from that would make their ADU still feasible. Kind of our obligation to be able to kind of work with them if the overall goal is to produce more housing. So I think this kind of two-pronged approach, I think, is the best. And okay.
Yes, I would definitely agree. So on our side, we do try to keep our website updated. We have an ADU page with all of the links and resources to all of the memos and information bulletins, our standard plans, and everything contained on that one site. So we try to keep that updated. So that would be a good place to start. For general questions, we do have a 311 hotline where applicant can connect with an engineer, plan check engineer, on duty every single day to answer these general types of questions. For the questions that are a little bit more specific or complicated, we do have our preliminary plan check meetings with our case management unit, and so we can apply, applicants can apply for a meeting with a case manager to go over any specific questions. We can also invite other departments and sections, you know, disabled access, planning, fire department, whoever else is needed within that meeting, we do coordinate that also. So we do have several resources available for applicants. And I would say, you know, for every city, it's important to kind of research what types of resources that each city can provide for each jurisdiction.
Yeah, it is very helpful to have information delivered properly on time to customers, so customers know our expectations. City of Santa Monica has a virtual counter system that 2-to-1, one planner and one building safety plan checker are meeting with the customer, whether it's a homeowner or an architect, and answering questions. Satina, I know does afternoon, again, 2-to-1 meetings, virtual meetings, they can ask bring their questions and have a preliminary plan check or at least information exchange. With information having on site or on internet website is very important too, when we have our information bulletins shown to customers, so they know they go to city website, need a question, get the answer there. And I would love to just mention that really City of LA has a very great system of information bulletins available for customers, and many small jurisdictions actually are referring to this information bulletins. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, it's all on our public website PDF version, so feel free to download it and use it as you see fit. Great work done by our team here at LA City.
All generations.
All generations. Yes, Mark, you get credit.
You get some credit there.
Moving on. And in the end too, I want to invite, I know there's a room full of industry experts, professionals here and online as well. Feel free to chime in on any of these answers as you see fit. I think Guillermo's monitoring our online chat. You can either post your comment and or question in the chat and or unmute and speak your question out loud. Just a few more questions here for the panel. We're going to move into pre-approved plans for accessory dwelling units. Are you familiar with jurisdictions using pre-approved plans for accessory dwelling units?
Yes, and in fact, AB 1332, in addition to limitation on 30-day limitation, also is requiring each jurisdiction have at least 6 pre-approved plans by January 2025. Of course, there will be so many questions on the liability on who is stamping these plans, who is the owner of these plans. These are not just the fence walls or type 5, as you call, like wood frame prescriptive provisions structure that could be approved like that. So these are full structures, detailed structures. I was involved in very first pre-approved ADU pre-approved plans approval, and before even starting the plan check, there were so many meetings, and I tried to explain the applicant, and they were very eager to get this approval. As we know that it's a great thing to have pre-approved plan, standard plan, that it makes easy, same way we work with the state approved, pre-approved manufactured buildings. It makes easier for approval process. At least we are not checking building and safety, parallel safety provisions of the building, just foundations. However, in some areas, for example, you are in a median area, you are in a hillside area, in a sloping lot, and so many other cases. And this, ironically, this first approved plan, the first application they tried to use, it was in a median area in a geologically sensitive area. They had to do so much, and it wasn't worth even to have that pre-approved plan. If someone is going to build tract homes like 100 or 200 of them, I see that there is a meaning for doing that. But if you are going to build three or five through the jurisdiction, it's taking so much time of get that approval than to do that. It's a good thing, but needs to be done more work there. And by this AB asking for each jurisdiction having at least six pre-approved plans, then how about when someone is bringing a pre-approved plan and locating on a landfill? So what is our answer? So unfortunately, the buyer or seller or broker selling that product never mentions, or they try to intentionally or unintentionally hide the fact that your soil needs to be strong enough to hold that structure. So there are some challenges there. There is a need of more work on that, but it's a great idea. To me, it's a great idea to have standard plans. But there is more work to be done there, in my opinion.
Thank you, Ara. You brought us some great points regarding site specificity with these standard plans. That would be the biggest challenge with using these standard plans. Before the requirement for each jurisdiction to have these AU standard plans came about, the City of LA already has a standard plan program for other kind of smaller structures, which we have applied to ADU projects. We have allowed design teams to submit for standard plans for ADUs, which they're able to submit electronically through our E-Plan LA system. And currently we have over 50 approved standard plans for ADUs. Those are all able to be viewed on our ADU website at LAPS.org. And so customer or owners are able to go in and see which ones have already been approved, contact that design team or manufacturer to try to choose a project that best suits for them. But again, you know, it's not a guarantee that it would be approved based on the site. So yes, if you have a very flat land and we're in not a planning sensitive kind of area, then sure, that would be a great way to get a permit for an ADU very quickly, and also to have it constructed very quickly or installed. It is prefabricated very quickly. So those are just some things to consider. Also, one thing that I've kind of noticed is that when applicants choose, let's say, prefabricated ADU that's kind of brought and like craned over into the site, a lot of times if it's in the rear, you know, how do they get it back there, right? So we've had issues with, you know, people trying to swing an ADU over a neighbor's house to get it back. And so, you know, you have to consider all of those things that you may not have, you know, considered when you're first choosing these kind of projects.
Just to add on to what Minnie said, also the size of the ADU that you may want to pick from pre-design. You have to make sure that it complies with, are you going with a state ADU size? Like our local jurisdiction, one local ordinance allows for up to 1,200, but you may be subject to more site specific design things or specific plans. So that would apply if you're going with the city's ordinance. And so the flexibility of can you cater that existing plan to meet the more specific regulations of the area that you want to locate it in, I think is also a key factor.
And I want to add to Mina's point, with all these pre-approved plans, unlike the state approved plans, there is a little bit challenge when it comes to code change, code cycle change. Imagine these 50 projects approved December 2022. In January 2023, no customer can use these plans because were based on the old code. They need to go through modification process, or they need to reapply for all these 50 projects to be approved for the new code. So is it a good thing? Again, it's a good thing, but does it take more extra work to do? Yes.
Just a quick question. I just wanted to clarify, maybe that the standard plans that you're approving are just the architectural, right? Not the structure.
No structural.
No structural plans are approved, just
No structural.
floor plans and elevations, right?
No, we actually approved for, all of the building. So fire life safety, structural, so in terms of, let's say, for example, seismic, right? When we're reviewing and approving these standard plans, we make sure that the design criteria or the seismic parameters are for more than the worst case that could possibly be within our jurisdiction. That way, when the owner comes in, they don't have an issue with, trying to beef up the, structural elements for that. So that's how we do it that way.
Oh, okay, so do you have all the plans on the website? Because all I saw was the architectural floor plan.
Yeah, so those are proprietary, owned by each of those companies, so we don't have the full set of plans. A customer can view the layout, and if it, meets their criteria, they can contact the manufacturer to get a copy of, or purchase a copy of that.
Oh, so, but they're already pre-approved as far as you guys did the plan check for the structural portion. What about the Title 24 inch?
That's correct. We've checked for all of those requirements. There are some instances, like for example, like solar panels, like if on the site we have a lot of shaded trees and you can kind of get an exemption from that. There are some minor adjustments that can be done for those kind of site conditions, but they are approved for all building code requirements.
Including Title 24 energy?
Yes, that's right.
How did they design for that?
Well, they have to, again, site specific, if there are certain specific parameters that they need to comply with, those will have to be adjusted.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, just to emphasize that, just because they choose a standard plan doesn't automatically guarantee them a permit. There's still a review based off the site. Quad, bring up a good point. The layout of the ADU, which direction it's facing, all those come into play when they apply for their permit. That's when we will review those requirements. Moving on, everyone's favorite topic, and I know, so I didn't want probably any confusion. If you have any comments on this specific question, we'll take them at this time, but then all other questions, we'll take those at the end. After we go through these pre-prepared questions here. Moving on, everyone's favorite topic, JADUs, junior accessory dwelling units. I know we see them often in the city, but I want to turn it over to the panel to get their opinion on it. Can you speak a little bit about your experience with JADUs?
I'll maybe get started. We don't at this point really have the exact numbers for the JADUs. Although it is in the building permit description, we were looking to see if we can come up with a number of how many JADUs have we done, but that number isn't as easily trackable at this point. So I was gonna ask Minnie if she's had any more kind of working permit related things to share on JADUs.
Yeah, so for JADUs, kind of just, those are very, very simple, kind of easy kind of projects. But maybe some of the challenges that we've seen are that maybe sometimes people are not aware that those are only allowed in the single family zones. And they're only allowed attached versus detached. And then they also have to be part of the, part of the single family dwelling. And so those are kind of the main issues that we're seeing that would prevent these JADUs from happening. But for the most part, they've been pretty straightforward and simple to.
To me, if it's attached and it's ADU or JDU, it's almost same, but for ADUs, we may have some additional requirements. For example, if JDU is allowed to have a door between the JDU and the main house, it means that the fire rating or noise control is not that critical. So recently there was a question again through admin committee here, so within the jurisdictions, how do we apply this? Well, imagine it's a garage conversion. Garage could be 400 square feet, which is less than 500 square feet. It could easily be JADU or ADU. When you ask the customer to provide 50 SDC noise control sound barrier or an 1 hour rating in between these two units, they go with JADU, say, well, I can have even door there remaining because that's just 500 square feet, less than 500 square feet. Other than that, also JADU is a little bit tough to enforce air conditioning system to have separate for a JADU. Of course, it can bring so many other questions like how can you allow the whole air circulation between two different units? Because technically that JADU can be even rented to someone else, right? But at this point, we don't have any mechanism, or I don't see any jurisdiction asking separate air conditioning unit for this JADU. So, or electrical system to be completely separated because it's existing electrical system. They are using the same panel, and it's up to the tenant and the landlord how to decide how he's going to pay the bills. When it comes to ADU, we have more freedom and to ask for more. That's the only difference I see there. When it comes to less than 500 square feet.
Absolutely, good point.
JADUs, if somebody wants to build a wall without access, would you allow that?
Yes, of course.
So
Yes, the question is if JADU, someone wants to have a JADU without having access between JADU and main house, yes. It says may have an access, doesn't say shall have.
Right.
So
And do you allow to have the JADU to have a separate address?
that's an interesting point. So for me personally, I feel that every unit, every dwelling unit needs to have assigned separate address. This is the way I have learned in city of LA. This is the way I do in city of Santa Monica. This is the way most of the jurisdictions do. Some jurisdictions may address, assign an address like alphabetical ABC for residential. Some of them go with numbers or fractional numbers. But recently I learned that some jurisdictions don't even assign separate address to detached accessory dwelling unit. I'm not going to say which jurisdiction is that. The building official is a good friend of mine, but I did explain my point that from the standpoint of the first responders, fire department, ambulance, police department addressing an emergency, it's very important to know where they're going.
No, for JADU, specifically speaking.
For JADU, yes, I would assign separate address, because if someone in JADU needs help and they call 911 and it has a separate entrance, and for first responders to be there quicker and provide service to that person, it's very important.
That's not what the state law says. The JADU is part of the house, and you're now, the same house, you're giving them two addresses.
To me, I would assign address. In Santa Monica, I do assign address and I have a justification for that because of the first responders orientation in a property. It may have same house, may have different entrances.
But when you assign an address, then you're saying the utilities are gonna be separated.
That's different. Utilities can be under the same.
Assign your address.
So address for first responders is different topic. Address for paying a gas bill is different.
But that's, like, for example, SCE requires you to have a separate address. If you want separate utility, you need a separate address. So now the same house has two utilities.
Again, Well, this is not about utilities. This is about, for me, address assignment is most important for address assignment. It's not for postal office to find your addressing. You can, in this case, you can have address for each window on your single family dwelling, but that's not the case. For me, if first responders are arriving to the site, they know which door to knock and which door to open. Same thing we do with the multi-family dwellings, same way if they have different addresses. If the condominium complex, we always ask to address to be in chapter 502 says you need to have address on the building.
That's a different- so
Yes,
separate-
for unit, I will ask. And my justification is to help first responders to find the location faster. Otherwise, imagine if a JADU, someone is having a problem in JADU and needs medical help, and every second counts, and first responders are knocking the main door and breaking the door, getting in, and no one is there. Then they find out that there is another unit there, but it's already fully.
Yeah, because you're considering it really as a separate unit.
I think,
Moving on, thank you.
I think Devin has regarding your earlier point, I think Devin has a comment.
Yeah, you're confusing meters and billing address, you do have to have a separate address, but simply having a separate address does not mean the DWP or the gas company or anyone is gonna give another service. In LA, we have to send a release. For example, if you convert your garage into an ADU, the person at the front house could still want to pay the bill. The meter only dictates billing. So having a separate address doesn't mean that you have to get a separate gas service, that you have to get a separate electrical service. So the logic of wanting a separate address for the safety of individuals therein is very sound. And if you still want one billing, then you don't have to request another meter.
Well, again, we're talking J, not A.
It doesn't matter. I just use ADU, but if you say JADU, it still doesn't matter. You can have the address. And if you want your bill, your one bill, we don't have to send another release to the gas company or DWP. So the address doesn't equal a separate service.
Yeah, we have Southern California, Edison. Edison requires, if we're gonna issue a separate meter, they require a separate address.
So that's different than LA. You can have an address and you don't have to have a separate service. That just relates to the billing in Los Angeles. I assume Santa Monica might be.
But if you, I'm sorry, but if you did want an additional meter release from DWP, you would have to have another address.
Yes.
Thank you.
Maybe I can, well, that challenge has come up. I know there's been, certain individuals who questioned the same with City of LA, that do I have to get an address? The JADUs, it could have an internal connection or it could not. And I think, for the purposes of exactly what Ara mentioned, it makes a lot of sense that you have a separate entrance into the unit, even though internally it could be connected or not, for it to be identifiable. Even if you're renting it out or someone's living there, they may want to get their separate mail, for example, as well. But yeah, the utilities have been a bit challenging, but even duplexes could have one water meter right now that's serving two. So I think it really depends on if that's the next thing to look at with JADUs or ADUs in general. If that's a barrier for someone, if it's a cost, I think it's a cost, it's additional kind of things that someone has to consider if they're now going to completely have the JADU be independent on utilities. The challenge has come up, but for the most part, I think it is pretty justifiable to identify it as a separate unit. It is a unit that someone could occupy and enter from a different access point.
I
So,
guess we have to go back to the state intent.
right, that may be another thing we need to flush out because it has other implications the minute you do have an address. Thank you for bringing it up, though. Yeah, we've encountered that too.
All right, so we'll move on to a few more questions here before we open it up to general questions. Going back to, I know the panel hit this one earlier slightly, but just basically discussing the issues, challenges, the nuances of adding an ADU to an existing multifamily building. Can the panel speak on that as the experience?
Now, multi-family dwellings, some of the questions like if I have a single family dwelling or duplex and adding the ADU, does it become a multi-family? Again, the state laws on the ADUs and JADUs did not amend the state building codes. So if by definition this becomes a multifamily and needs to be subject to building code, not residential code, then so be it. The main challenge, I would say not challenge, question that people are afraid of facing is that if it becomes a multifamily dwelling, now how am I going to deal with accessibility or exiting? Most cases I have seen in multifamily dwellings, the portion of the building becoming an ADU, it's either recreational room that usually has higher occupancy than those usually it's assembly occupancy, becoming a separate dwelling unit. So I'm not worried about the number of occupants from exiting from that level. I don't recall any case that will add to the occupant load. Or garages, or electrical room or some rooms that are at the first floor most of the time, that they don't have an issue. Accessibility is something to be worried and to take care of it when it comes to plan check and inspection. But also with accessibility, I just want to remind everyone that the covered multifamily dwellings and Chapter 11A applies only covered multifamily dwellings. And by creating extra 2 units and making fourplex to 6 units, if this building is not a covered multifamily dwelling to start with, doesn't need to comply with accessibility. 1985 is the date when California started to have regulations on 5 or more residential units for accessibility, and March 13, 1991 is the date when, until now, it didn't change anything. We apply 3 or more dwelling units for apartments and 4 or more dwelling units for condominiums. In this case, yes, if you have multifamily dwelling that is covered multifamily dwelling, and you are adding more units, let's say it's an elevator building and you have on the 3rd floor, you're adding a unit, yes, they need to comply with accessibility requirements. We cannot waive this requirement. These are state building laws. We need to comply with this.
Yeah, and some of the, another challenge that we faced for adding ADUs or converting portions within existing multifamily ADUs are the requirements for providing egress windows. So they would have to provide openings along certain walls in order to accommodate these ADUs. There is a section in the state code that was implemented in January that says the addition of an ADU does not constitute a change in our occupancy. And so for LA City, we've allowed for an existing duplex, if you're adding converting a portion of it to an ADU, for it to remain R3 occupancy. And so that's one of the things that we've been doing even before, and now especially starting January. Some zoning considerations or amenity considerations would be if you have, let's say, you're converting, like let's say a rec room into an ADU, you know, it does remove that amenity space for that multifamily dwelling, so that's something to consider. Although we do not prohibit that from being done, that would be a big loss for the residents there. And something to consider also is for brand new multifamily dwellings that are proposing an ADU, that ADU would be considered as one full unit in terms of open space requirements. So for City of LA zoning code, we do have that requirement, and the ADUs do count towards that.
Yes, we have a question.
Yeah, I think I heard 2 different examples up there. You had a duplex, you're adding on an ADU or you go to another space, maybe it was a garage. Now you're having 3 units under one roof.
Wait.
Sorry.
Right here. We're gonna have a question. We're gonna have people here.
Okay.
Hybrid world.
One example, a duplex, you're adding on an ADU or you're converting another space that may be a garage, and now you're having 3 units under one roof. Then you'd mentioned that the law says that a residential would stay a residential in R3 in that example. But already you mentioned that adding a 3rd unit but then change the occupancy and now all of the state codes apply. The question is, from a 2-unit or duplex R3, adding another unit, would that be an R2, change of occupancy? Given all the state laws and all the Senate bills that we currently have right now, for us, the question is fire sprinklers. We currently require fire sprinklers. That's the path that we want to go down. What does the panel say? And I may ask the group by a raise of hands, would you guys call that a change of occupancy? Because in the Senate bill, I think it's 897, says if it raises the public threat of health and safety. You have a single family dwelling, duplex, let's just say, I'm now increasing, maybe I'm adding 2 more units. I'm going from 2 to 4, or 2 to 6, or, I mean, it can keep going on and on, right? At what point does it not become a public threat? So going from a lower occupancy classification to a higher occupancy classification is a greater threat.
Okay, I'll stick to my point because the state law specifically for fire sprinklers state that if the single family dwelling or duplex, they are not sprinkled, then ADU doesn't need to be sprinkled. So with that provision of a building code, I'm not worried about. But other than that, if it's a 3-unit, and maybe I'm mistaken, but I don't recall any place saying that this is, maybe it's a residential occupancy, but R2 also residential occupancy. For me, I'm going to look at that as R2 occupancy. With keeping in mind that state is allowing me not to sprinkle that additional unit and entire building, not to sprinkle the building. That's the way I will approach.
One more question.
I think, I agree with, Lynn.
Hold up, bud. We have the microphone right here. Let him- he was there.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on that we mentioned that a duplex, adding another dwelling unit is not regarded by the state then as an R2 occupancy. What if you're gonna have a duplex and you're gonna add 2 units? And then at what point would you say, oh, this is now an R2? Because we have to keep in mind, folks, we have to report inspections, annual inspections of multifamily buildings, R2 occupancies, 3 or more units. Okay, it's a lot to go through as an inventory to inspect every multifamily building. So now, when we turn this building from a duplex, which is an R3, into an R2, we're adding it to our inspection inventory. We're also getting addressing. We're going to get a fire extinguisher on the outside of the building, because really, folks, what we're dealing with now is a commercial occupancy. It's not a residential occupancy. You go into the multiple listing service that the realtors use, you can buy income property, and it's in a different location than the single family dwellings. So if you're having a client that's looking for income property, they're out there like hotcakes. They're 3-unit buildings or more. So if you're going to turn a duplex into a 3-unit building and it's not sufficiently separated to where it would be 2 R3s, like a townhouse, you could have an 8-unit townhouse building come in the residential code as an R3. So if you have a duplex and you add a 3rd unit, you can separate it with construction, so you have 2 R3s. But I find it difficult how you still call it an R3. If the state law says you do, are they gonna cap it at 4 units or 5 dwelling units? How about 6 dwelling units added, and then it's still an R3? It's just creating a little bit of a problem with the building code and how we're enforcing these. And by the way, these are our biggest challenges at Long Beach right now. The multifamily building adding an ADU, that's an easy one for us to stand. We're already doing an annual inspection. They're just adding another unit, that's fine. The single family adding an ADU, that's also fine. We don't inspect those annually. When you cross over, those two occupancy classifications, they're very different from each other. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to point out that, the state provision, it mentions for existing multifamily. So it says it does not constitute a change in our occupancy. So the only situation this would apply is if you have a duplex and you're converting a portion of that into an ADU, an existing portion. You're not expanding the footprint because the ADU provisions do not allow for more than one when you have an existing duplex. So you can't have two ADUs, you can't have three, you can only have one whenever you have a duplex. And it's within the existing building. Now for proposed, if you're proposing a duplex with an attached ADU, that's not an existing multifamily, that's proposed. So we would consider that an R2 occupancy. So it's kind of addressing the hardship that exists when you have an existing building that's already been being occupied and you're converting a portion of that existing space into an ADU.
And this may be a little bit different, but in our ordinance with the city of LA, in the development standards, we also try to address kind of that issue, not as much through an occupancy, but more of a development standards that if you are in an area that's hillside or very high fire severity zone, and you are required to have some higher thresholds because we can impose them as part of the local ordinance. And one of them is that you do have to have a sprinkler system in compliance with the LA plumbing code. So we do have standards that we can impose through our ordinance if someone's proposing to do a ADU through our ordinance, but with the state, we are kind of bound by some of the regulations that the state currently also passed, but as Beignet stated, it is very limited and applicable in certain situations.
Yeah, I agree with you. The duplex issue, the state law is very clear because they specifically meant existing R3 occupancies. If you have a duplex and you add or change garage, convert it into an ADU, now you have 3 units. They don't want you to change that from R2 because the intent of the law is to increase, affordable housing. And they didn't want us to get into all the other technical issues of changing the occupancies from R3 to R2 because it does make it more difficult to implement the ADU laws. So for these specific situations, they want to keep it on R3. And even though, Mimi is right. You can only, with duplex, you can only have one ADU. You can't have 2 or 3 or 4. So it specifically applies to this situation.
So before,
So, with all due respect, what I'm hearing is you can have a duplex and then you can add that unit, right? 2 years later, can you add another ADU? Because you'd have a recorded document that said it's only a duplex forever for the life of this thing, and you can add one ADU. You can't ever redevelop it. You can't sell it to another person who wants to chop it up and do 4 and then not sprinkler it because it was already, there was a duplex, you added a 3rd unit, and now 2 years later, or 5 years later, you just add another one, and you say, well, this is the one that didn't get sprinklers, so it's okay.
Actually, in this case, if you have a duplex, the state law will allow you to have only one additional ADU. And that status is going to be ADU for many years there. So it's not going to be 3rd unit as a regular unit. So there is no way, if I may, there is no way in 3-4 years come back and say this is a triplex and I'm adding another unit. Because we have the inventory and count the units. Question about duplex becoming triplex, is it the R3 or R2? I would suggest that this discussion just to bring to State Fire Marshal's office and have their interpretation. We can contact them and get back to you. That will be the best, I think, at this point. Because different jurisdictions right now, they are applying differently, and Long Beach, I am sure, has also its own issues there on implementation of this. Then we'll get back to you. How about that?
Oh, great. Question right here.
As you're considering that, I think the one thing to keep in mind in the state's language is this is an accessory dwelling unit, not a dwelling unit. So the reason that it's not considered an R3 to an R2 in some of the initial, your question about what does all the legislation bring us to, I think we need to go to the state park marshal to figure that out, but we can't speculate on what the future state law is, but the way I see the current state law is that R3, when you add an accessory dwelling unit, you're not technically adding another dwelling unit, you're adding what they call an accessory dwelling unit. There's a different definition for that in the 2022 code. And I think that's where the loophole comes into all of that to try to skirt some of the requirements you're talking about.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Is this in a scenario where you have a lot size that you could build more than 2 units, regular units, right? And then, so you're building an ADU, the ADU would not trigger some of these, sprinkler situations. But then if you come back and you build regular units, you want to add on to the density. Again, this is not my specialty, but I would think that's not, that could be subject to all the standards of the code. That is not protected under the ADU provisions. So, I think if you came back and wanted to up the density, the ADU stays the ADU, but if you're adding on to the regular units, that occupancy is for whatever normally you would do, not for the ADU. State law. Right?
So there's a recorded document that says it can't. So there's a recorded document then for the life of the property that says it's an ADU.
Correct, but I guess when you're adding onto it, you're now adding on to the regular units, right? So those regular units have to comply with regular code.
Yeah, we're getting many, again, this is just because it's the small percentage of ones that we're very challenged on. Many of them are just, pretty much for us are flying right through. But this is creating, you get an architect that's maybe a newer firm, you get an owner that doesn't really know much, and the architect goes, yeah, we can get you some ADUs. That's really what happens. So when we're dealing with that, it creates a lot of staff time because we'll go months into the submittal, and then they realize that, yes, it is an occupancy change. And will the building department classify it at the end of the process as an R2 or an R3? And so if you add on one ADU, we're getting stuck with duplex adding 2 ADUs in the garages below.
Is this in the coastal zone as well?
We have in the coastal commission administrative boundary.
Okay, because my understanding of this is from a few years ago was that if you had more density to tap into, you would have to first do that before you could do ADUs. I thought that was, yeah, I think years ago we were working with our kind of just the areas that were within the coastal. I think that was also the preference where you exhaust all the density and then kind of do the ADUs. But that could be a bit outdated on my part, but that's a very interesting point because I think we've seen this come up with coastal areas.
And we are getting a lot of these right now, and we're very user-friendly for ADUs. It's just that we know that crossover from R3 to R2 is a giant jump. It becomes a commercial occupancy that investors are buying these then and just renting them out. Now they have multi-unit buildings that don't have the components that an R2 would normally require if it was built new.
Well, the state fire marshal has weighed in on that. IB 2105-005. It is a change of occupancy for the duplex and added ADUs. It goes from R3 to R2. Yeah. I'm here. Look at them.
Yeah,
What was the ID number?
IB 21-005. That was issued August 5th, 2021.
Right, so that was before.
Before the assembly bill.
Yeah, that was before. I think there needs to be some communication.
Still on their website.
Yeah, no, I know.
I think we need to move.
Okay, so we have one more question and we'll jump into the general questions. I'll give Devin a chance to weigh in here. Last question related to inspection. Again, I invite Devin and all the other code enforcement inspectors out there in case I miss anything. Well, we're talking about how to mitigate some of the common ADU design issues that come up during inspection. So some of the common ones would be the missing foundation at the garage doors for garage conversions. And contractors not wanting to add one. You have missing sill plates, or sill plates with no curves, missing dimensions, missing clearances for bathrooms, kitchens within an existing floor plate, shower size not meeting minimum requirements, sewer connections, sump pumps. If the panel can speak on some of the common issues they come across during inspections and how they would advise to mitigate those issues.
How to mitigate code violations, okay. So for the first few items, what we've done at Building and Safety, it's also available on our website. We created an information bulletin that addresses the majority of what you spoke to. We allow slight deviation from the code in reference to the foundation, the depth of the footings, things like that. As far as other minimum dimensions that relate to safety, certain things you can request a modification. If there is a reasonable alternative, then we can consider it on a case-by-case basis. But other things that are required by code, they just have to be met. I mean, I could go from one at a time, but there is no blanket answer to say that things that violate the code can be approved. They can request a modification. That's about it.
I was hoping longer answer for this long question. It's right, so I agree with you. So, and I would add it's not only just ADUs, any project coming to the inspection stage, it's building and safety is the one that needs to do a better job to make sure that the inspection, we have clear plans and clear representation of the site conditions. Of course, with ADUs being converted, some structure being converted to habitable space, it will happen more. But as in any project, whether it's a brand new building or it's a conversion or addition, I would say the building safety needs to make sure that when the permit plans are taken in, the sufficient information is provided. That's one thing. And when the plan check is done, so whether it's a shower side or the knee space for the toilet or exit window sizes, everything needs to be shown. Vents for dryers or any other vents, because it's being so close to the property line. In some cases, plan check needs to pay more attention because common mistakes or common missing information on plans will be that because it's too close to the property line, showing existing window there, which is not permitted at that fire separation distance. So plan check needs to do better work to make sure that our inspection has all information on film. So with ADUs, it happens a little bit more because we are dealing with the sump pump on the drainage. We are dealing with the, I don't want to open now new turbo questions like plumbing or sewer line going through certain areas. So there are so many things that need to be addressed on plan. It needs to be addressed on plan. And in some jurisdictions, they don't show any electrical or mechanical or plumbing plans with their plans. It's just they get building permit based on building plans. And of course, it gets on the inspection shoulder to make sure that everything is in compliance. I would suggest to have better plans, ask the customer to provide better plans, more information, complete plans, and plan check to address all these questions that are not there.
Just real quick, a follow-up. So in LA, our plan checkers would need to look at that. I mean, for an ADU, 400 or 500 square feet, they're not going to send it to our mechanical or electrical plan check division. Those items do fall to inspectors, but as Laura said, you could work with a pre-inspection meeting, things like that. A violation is a violation, but our plan checkers with the volume of work that we have in LA, there's no way that they'd be able to look at plumbing, electrical, and mechanical on something like a 400 square foot accessory dwelling unit. So those wouldn't be checked with our plan checkers, but the inspectors with a pre-construction meeting, emails, phone calls, we try to assist, but the code has to be adhered to.
Do you have a pre-con meeting for all your ADUs?
Do we have a pre-con meeting for all ADUs? We have a lot of those. I mean, if someone calls for it, we'll absolutely do it. But more often than not, there are questions that could be answered over the phone, via email. Now we even do virtual inspection. But if someone requests it and we have the time, we'll absolutely make a pre-construction meeting.
Is there a minimum breaker required for the ADU?
For an ADU, 60 amp.
As far as the kitchen goes, a lot of the times there's instances where you need minimum 220s for the kitchen. Countertops maybe about 2 feet. Is there some sort of leniency for that for ADUs in your city?
Which part?
Just the minimum requirements for circuits for kitchens.
There's not enough countertop?
Yeah, there's a foot or maybe a foot and a half. You implement the 220 amps.
A foot and a half wouldn't be sufficient for kitchen sink space. Usually in LA, we define the kitchen as 10 square feet of countertop, and it would have to have the minimum 220 amp circuits. Again, you could request a modification, and if there was some unique reason why the code could not be complied with, we could entertain that. But otherwise, you would need the 220 amp circuits and at least 10 square feet of counter.
Devin, when you walk into one of the garages, the existing one, and you look at they don't have the drywall, but you don't see the paper kind of all drawn. And the stucco is kind of bulging, it's not connected to the wood. How do you deal with that?
Fortunately, I don't go in the field anymore. With something like that, it's case by case. Usually people are going to remove that. Unfortunately, in some areas, South LA and different parts of the city, almost anything that they do is going to repair or make better older structure. But it just depends on how bad the existing construction is, whether or not, a lot of times the plant will reference that they have to replace it. Are we talking about something that's 3 feet from the property line or closer, where now 1 hour separation is required? It just depends. It's case by case.
Okay, we'll go ahead and open it up to general questions. I know there are a few online, so we can go through the ones in the chat. And then if those that want to speak openly after that.
So I'll just start with one of the top ones.
I'm gonna go back.
Cool. And one of them we've kind of already addressed, which is how we address backflow prevention devices between the main house new ADUs and new JADUs. Is there anything specific, in addition to what we've already discussed, that would kind of address any additional requirements for backflow?
So we'll open that up to any inspection or enforcement. Devin, want to take a crack at it?
Backflow is not required between the house and an ADU, so there's nothing that's required. I believe it was in July 2021 that the plumbing code section 311.1 independent systems had exception added where now you can connect the ADU directly to the back of the dwelling, and it does not require any backflow prevention. So whether they choose to go around the dwelling and connect to the building sewer or connect to the back of the dwelling, there is no backflow prevention required unless it was otherwise required due to the elevation of the city sewer.
But that's a new permit, right?
Well, that's, so as of 2021, again, I think it's July 1st, 2021, you can connect to the back of the dwelling. Prior to that, you could still connect in front of the house, but it still would not require backflow prevention unless it was originally required for that lot or for the building.
And another additional question that we had, and I think it's just clarifying on some of the zoning we touched on. It just says, if you have an existing duplex with an attached carport that is being converted to an ADU, is that seen as a change of occupancy classification from R3 to R2? That-
I think we already answered that question in great depth.
Right, yes. Yeah, and I think we've, a lot of these came as we were going through the panel, so I believe we've kind of touched on a lot of these. Yeah, there's some pretty extensive, obviously, on the big issues that we've all kind of discussed as far as zoning and inspection issues, but I'll pass it back on to you.
We're about 5 minutes left, so I don't know if there's anything, any of those questions you feel that we haven't addressed, Guillermo, or we have another question back here.
In regards to cooktops, are we requiring to have one or two burners?
What's the definition of permanent?
And the definition of permanent?
Yeah.
People get really creative.
Okay, so that document that I referred to that's on our website, ledbs.org, if you just go in the search and type in detached, it's one of the first PDFs that'll come up. We defined all of that. Per my recollection is that at least 2 burners. And permanent, I believe it says something like it has to stand on 4 legs. I have to look at it. It doesn't come up all too often, especially not to rise to the level of management. But I believe that's what it was.
That's not for JADUs, so right, there's no requirement for that.
ADU.
Regular
Yeah, ADU, not JADU. Get it, me? Yeah, so at least 2 burners, if I'm not mistaken, and I believe that's it's on the document. I believe that's to stand on 4 legs. It can't be the kind of deal they have at the job sites, you know, it's got a hot plate, a microwave, that won't cut it. It has to be at least something with 2 burners or.
Good question.
Any other questions?
I have a question, Devin.
Somebody want to put on the hot seat.
Okay, so, what happens when a contractor on the field notices, you know, like deteriorated members and decides to take everything out?
So if this is an ADU that's near the property line or somewhere where you couldn't construct a new one, ultimately what we would do if they take it out, which they frequently do. If you demolish everything, you now need a demo permit. So we would send them back to the plan check division. They would need a supplemental permit to change the work description of the building because now it's no longer an alteration, it's a new building, and they would need a demo permit to demolish the structure that they were previously converting.
How are we doing the check? Up to date?
So do you allow them to put it in the same spot?
Goes to plan check.
Yeah.
Does the ADU have an exception as long as you don't change the footprint? You can stay within that property line or the setback?
It's stretching, but yeah.
Yes, question she wants to ask. When plans do not agree with the site conditions, I would suggest inspection sent back to plan check. My personal experience, there was a case when a couple of studs were just because of the condition. They asked by engineer of record to be replaced. But those couple of studs were just at the border of a 50% of exterior wall removal. So that planning had completely different requirement for all this structure. So by mistake, if you allow them just to approve that and continue, and they are already not complying with the local zoning code or some other codes. So my suggestion to inspectors, whenever there is a discrepancy between the site conditions and the plans, send back to plan check for approval.
Are you just looking for a smart way to do it?
Yeah.
Okay, here, I'll do it. Okay, so if you encounter that, the best way to do it would be to sister with the, okay, and at some point you can pull the existing ones out, but likely once you wrap the building, if the foundation is deteriorated as well, obtain, at least in LA, a permit to do foundation replacement. You can't take it all out at once, but once you have certain approvals, you can do that work and now everything's existing. Wherein the problem lies is that people pull it all out before they even start the job. Now you have nothing that's existing. If you do sections, slot cuts, whatever it happens to be, and replace the foundation and we approve it, that's now approved and existing. If you sift through the studs and later in the job, pull the old ones out, we've already inspected the framing and approved it, that's fine. It's only when people jump the gun or the sequence and remove the building, now you got the problem. So there are ways to do it. Pre-construction meetings usually when we can point things like that out. There are options. We don't want you to keep wood that's gonna fall apart, throughout construction, but it still has to be right sequentially.
Well, this question is supposed to understand. Why don't just zoning just make it simple and say, okay, you can, if you have a structure,
Yeah,
why don't you just allow them to remove it and build exactly where it's.
yeah.
They'll do it every time.
I mean,
wish I had a magic wand.
honestly, from a structural point of view, it's much better.
Right, and I think it really depends on, I guess, there is something in our ordinance that does allow that, and I was just kind of referencing it, I just closed the page on it, but, there is a provision that says if you're gonna kind of reconstruct in the exact same location and the dimension as the existing, you can do that, and that's in our local ordinance. So there are things built in our ordinance that would kind of deal with that situation. But I guess I'm just wondering, depending on what option of ADU or what the existing kind of are the attached, detached, how that might affect them. But I think for the most part, we've been pretty flexible and working with the applicant where it makes sense. And they came across an issue in inspection, it was sent back. Usually at that point, Minnie and I would review it, and if it makes sense and they're doing exactly what we thought they're gonna do, we tend to be pretty flexible. I can't think of one that we said, oh, too bad, you now need to go and completely redesign it. So it doesn't come up that often, but when it does, we kind of see if it meets the requirements, and most of the time it has, I think.
Yeah, because from an engineering perspective, it's gonna be a brand new structure. I'd rather have that than something made up.
It's the non-conforming, I guess, stuff that might be an issue, right? And that one we kind of defer to building and safety, that they lose all non-conforming rights? Or can we still say that they can retain, especially if it was an existing structure that was completely not having even the 4-foot setback? That's a hard one to keep, right? If you're gonna rebuild it, then you just kind of move it, so it has a 4 feet minimum.
I think it's kind of like Devin said, that if they come in before they remove, there's a lot more leniency, it seems like. Because you can talk about it, you can look at it, you can go over it, but 9 out of 10 times it just gets removed 100%. Even the footings, everything gets removed. Yep, it's falling apart. And that's when at least Santa Monica really makes them comply with the new zoning and setbacks. New building, basically.
Yep. All right, if there are no other questions for the panel, I'd like to give them a round of applause. And if there are no other updates, we can go ahead and conclude the meeting. Thank you, everyone, for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.